Hello and welcome to another episode of our Brothers Creed podcast, where we talk about experiences, motivation, and exploring the world around us. We're the Thomas Brothers, and I'm Jared.
I'm Ethan. Today we are going to be talking about an interesting topic of intimidation.
Intimidation tactics.
Yeah. So intimidation can mean a lot of different things. It can be personal. It can be individual. A person can be intimidating. It could be intimidation in your business, or it can be intimidation as big groups of people, maybe in war, or maybe sports teams do things that are intimidating. So it's going to be really interesting kind of digging into intimidation tactics and is it positive or is it negative?
And some of the examples throughout history. We got a lot of examples, some cool ones that I think it would be just interesting to learn about. So
yeah, all right, let's do it.
You can't climb the ladder of success with your hands in a pocket.
We will not go quietly into the night.
They tell me you're a man with true grit.
I am the one who knocks.
Don't ever tell me what I can't do, ever!
That's how winning is done.
First off, what I wanted to do is just give a Webster's Dictionary definition of intimidation. So intimidation is intentional behavior that would cause a person of ordinary sensibilities to fear harm or injury. So somebody who is of ordinary sensibility, so just a normal person, right, to fear harm or injury. I think a lot of times intimidation is confused with bullying or harassment, right? But there's actually different layers there. Intimidation is more of to like scare or frighten someone, but bullying is actually trying to bring harm to a person. It's kind of a fine line, but you think of like intimidation, maybe a really tall bodybuilder who's like really tall and just massive, right? Their presence might be intimidating. Yeah. And they might, in the gym, they might be like when they're doing their lifts and they're yelling at the top of their lungs. That might be intimidating, right? I don't know. Or might make me laugh.
It must not be in Planet Fitness, right?
Yeah, seriously. But a teenager who trips somebody in the hallway and laughs at them as they drop all their books all over the floor, I mean, that's bullying, right? Yeah. And so there is a fine line because nowadays you can't really say things. I mean, bullying can be, definitely bullying can be verbal as well, and there's all different types of things. But intimidation is just an interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing that I think that sometimes you can intimidate people without even knowing it.
Yeah.
One of the things that
definitely
I think is interesting that my wife, who's gorgeous, by the way, she is a very outgoing person. She's very pretty, and she was in a kind of a church calling, kind of a service calling, where she was working with the young women of the ward of our congregation. And so she's working with the young women, and someone came in to work alongside her, and this person was very shy, and they were very reserved. And for the first maybe week or two, they just couldn't hardly talk to my wife, and my wife was very outgoing to them. And then later, when they got to know my wife a little bit better, they kind of revealed to her, I was really intimidated by you at first. You're just so pretty and you're so outgoing, and I didn't, that was very intimidating to me. And so I just find that that's interesting that, those kind of someone else's strengths and their attributes can almost be a threat, or it can be perceived as a threat to some people who may not be an extrovert, or who may not be, they may not think they're, very good looking or whatever. And so that can be seen as intimidation as well.
Or something that maybe is my weakness. If I have a weakness in something that I'm very aware of and I'm thinking about it and everything else, and then I see somebody who that is like their strong point, that's definitely like, oh man, like that's a little bit intimidating, right? It's hard. It's kind of hard to approach that person because you feel like, oh man, they're so much better or whatever else. And so it's definitely interesting. What I was making a short list of things that what makes people intimidating, and it could be so many different things. It could be size. Maybe somebody's really tall. It could be muscles. Maybe somebody is really big. It could be intelligence or intellect. Maybe someone is just so super smart, and then when you talk to them, it's just like right over your head. You're like, what the heck are you talking about?
Yeah.
And there's this one guy. It's not intimidating at all, but at work, when he talks, he uses like, I think he's got a thesaurus like on his computer, and like he uses these words that are like, literally when he says the words, I'm like, what does that word mean? Like, I don't know what you're saying. I'm relatively educated, but I was like, I don't even know what that word means. And so there's been a couple of times where I've like looked up what the word means, and it's not intimidating because it seems so forced. Yeah. It's like he's talking to a bunch of people and he's like, actually, according to my research and blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, no, dude. But it's funny. So intellect, someone maybe who is unfriendly or that seems unfriendly, maybe sometimes introverts, people that don't really like social gatherings and they just kind of sit off in the corner by themselves. They could be unapproachable or can seem intimidating.
Like, imagine if you were going to go up and like argue against some political like gene or like know-how, or I mean like imagine if you were going to go on live TV and argue a point against Ben Shapiro. It's just like, oh geez, like that would be intimidating to me because I don't know. Like the guy talks so fast. Like he's like one of the only podcasts I can't listen to on double speed because he talks so fast. And so I'm like, wait a sec, what did you say to me? Or like, what? It's just like,
he would be on to the next topic before I could even register what he just said.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be like an example of intimidation versus, because you're like, oh, I want to be able to keep up. I want to be able to do this,
Yep. People that don't offer lots of facial expressions, it's hard to read people, can be intimidating. People that don't really express emotion sometimes can be intimidating.
Yeah.
And then kind of goes along with intelligence maybe, but people that are super successful or that are very rich or very wealthy, it's almost it's maybe a little bit of a complex on the person who's there that's kind of like, oh, I don't even measure up to this person, and it's just the whole their presence is intimidating. Like if we were to have Jeff Bezos on the podcast here, I'd be a little bit intimidated just because it's like, this is a high profile guy that's worth more money than I could even imagine.
Yeah, man. I'd probably wear like a suit to the podcast scene.
No, a tuxedo.
Tuxedo.
We could both wear tuxedos.
Are you saying Pam or Pan?
I see you wore a tuxedo to a janitor's interview.
I think it's Pan. Yeah, that was from Step Brothers. If you don't know what that movie is, pretty funny. One of the quotes I saw was interesting. It said, while leaders with social intelligence use empathy and soft power to build bridges, politically intelligent leaders use intimidation and hard power to exploit the anxieties and vulnerabilities they detect. So that's, I think, one of the ways that if you're trying to intimidate someone, you're trying to expose their vulnerabilities and their anxieties. And so, let's just say if I was trying to intimidate someone and I knew that they were kind of an introvert, I would try to pull them out or try to call them out in a conversation to where they would feel intimidated or exposed. They exploit their anxieties so that they're like, put them off their feet, and then that would be a way to intimidate someone like that.
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the ways that we came up with a bunch of examples here, I think one of the first ones I actually want to share is General George Patton. And one of the things that he used to do, he's such a character in history, and I think it's so funny how he used to practice his so-called general's face, quote unquote, and he wanted to do that. He would practice that in the mirror so that he would appear terrifying and menacing in his countenance. So he would practice kind of making a mean face in the mirror.
Mean mug in the mirror.
Exactly, mean mugging, so that people would think, oh man, that guy's mean. I don't want to mess with him. Because if you walk around with a smiley disposition as a general, people are going to be like,
he's a pushover.
They might not respect you as much. So it's interesting, some of the other things that General Patton, so he didn't naturally have a deep, booming voice, unlike the George C. Scott in the movie Patton. who did have a deep voice. George Patton, he was a master of the dramatic pause. He would lower his voice to great effect, forcing the audience to listen carefully before bellowing out a line of profanity, usually. While with the skill of a method actor, Patton would also strive to achieve intimidating with his war face to communicate his intensity. So that's his general face that he would practice. So he would use that dramatic pause, and he would use his language and his face to create this tough exterior, even though his voice was a little bit higher. And so I thought that was one of the interesting aspects from history. He was trying to create this persona of this tough, this mean guy that basically has become a legend over the years. One of the other ones that I like about intimidation, but it also it's not quite intimidation, but it is kind of goes back to your mindset. So I was thinking, like there are cultures all over the world that use war paint, face paint, and they will paint symbols, on their faces. There was when the Romans were fighting the barbarians of the north, the barbarians, where they were with like blue symbols on their faces. They believed that those were like, not like protection from the gods, and the barbarians would fight like wild men, and they terrified the Romans because these guys had with wild abandon. They were just, like animals, and so that terrified the Romans, and that those face paints gave so much confidence to those who were wearing it. Face paints have also been used for other reasons. Kind of one of the other reasons why face paints sometimes will work is because if your face is masked, you almost feel like you are a different person. And the actions that you're about to take are not you, but someone else. And that's why you see like the Predator movies. What does Schwarzenegger do before he kills the Predator?
He always puts face paint on, or Commando, where it's like
he always puts that Commando on his face, right? And so almost anything you see, or like Rambo when he gets mud all over himself and he just jumps out of the trees and just stabbing people. It's like it's not quite an intimidation, but it's like a way for you to get in the mindset of I'm someone else, or I am invincible. One of the interesting stories, there's a great book called The Art of War. It's an ancient book. Sun Tzu, if you haven't ever read it, go check it out. It's really kind of a collection of cool stories and sayings. But one of the stories in it was about a general who assembled his troops and told them, quote, I will toss a coin. Basically, they were in a situation where they were outnumbered. The troops were outnumbered, so the general brought his guys together and said, I will toss a coin after visiting the shrine, and if it lands on heads, we will be victorious. So he tosses a coin and it lands on heads. They had so much confidence that they defeated their enemy very swiftly, even though they were outnumbered.
What if it landed on tails?
He said after the battle, one of his priests said, you cannot change destiny. He said, you can with a rigged coin, showing him the double-sided coin.
So it's kind of like a heads I win, tails you lose situation.
Exactly. So it was the belief that they gave them certainty that they would have that advantage that allowed them to beat the opposite army that had them outnumbered. And so really that belief in that supernatural protection, that's what gave them the confidence. And it wasn't necessarily that, the coin, whatever. And so that's kind of it goes in with the war paint and that believing that you are invincible, believing that you are furious. That is what really can be intimidating to the enemy, is just that confidence in yourself.
Interesting. I like that. I mean, heads we're going to win, and no matter what it is, it's going to be heads.
It's like Harvey Dent, or no, what's the Two-Face?
Yeah. Two-Face.
He's got the coin,
Yeah, but one side is actually
well, that's after, but before, he would he'd make his own luck, right?
Yeah. So, I got a couple different examples of war situations as well. This is one that when you're looking into intimidation it's kind of like, I don't know, all is fair in love and war, right? It's kind of like if someone can use an intimidation tactic to make it so the other side surrenders, then isn't that actually saving lives? If they didn't actually go to battles with each other, then...
No, well, the thing is that rarely intimidation makes you not go to battle. From my research, mostly what intimidation is to defeat the enemy mentally before you go and defeat them physically.
Yeah,
get them on their
true.
heels, and then I'm going to come and attack you. Because well,
I guess maybe it would make the defeat quicker, maybe. Or
there are cases where there was propaganda, people dropping propaganda posters and stuff like that across enemy lines, trying to get people to surrender, or it's actually interesting. Well, you go ahead and tell your story.
Well, so there was this one guy, Timur. He's a ancient ruler. Don't know all the details, but one of the things that he would do is he would tower up the skulls of his enemies that he had conquered on the outsides, and he would tower these skulls outside of the cities of people that he was going to attack. And so it was like hundreds of thousands of skulls that he would pile in front of the entrance to these cities, and basically it was just like his intimidation tactic of everyone else has died and you will too.
Oh, geez.
Which is kind of interesting. It says it was estimated that his campaign caused the death of 17 million people, or a fifth of the world's population at that time.
Wow.
It's kind of crazy. Yeah. And so it was basically stretched through Mesopotamia and throughout China.
Crazy.
Which was kind of interesting. Yeah. Another one that's interesting that I'll kind of throw in with that is, have you ever heard of the Aztec death whistle? So basically,
no.
It's this little clay whistle that the Aztec would make. But the thing is, when you blow into it, it is like this horrifying screeching sound that they likened it to basically the screams of 1,000 people, the wails of 1,000 people dying.
Oh, geez.
And I've actually heard, maybe we'll throw this up on some of our socials, but there is a guy, I think I saw it on YouTube or something like that, but he actually blows one of these whistles, and it's pretty crazy. It literally sounds like a person screaming in horrifying screams.
Oh, wow.
And so what they would do is you would have, these armies of hundreds of or thousands, tens of thousands of Aztecan warriors, and they would all have these death whistles, and they would march into battle blowing these whistles in unison, and it would just sound like the wailing, suffering screams of people, and it was so intimidating to the enemy just because it's it's just this eerie, creepy sound that it makes.
That's kind of like the Dothraki screamers.
Yeah.
Well, I have something similar. There was in the Vietnam War, there was something called Operation Wandering Soul, and the villagers would tell stories about haunted jungle spirits, and how they believed that spirits would scream and wander in the night, and that these screams of these ghosts would send haunting wails across the darkness. So the U.S. soldiers recorded creepy sounds and wails, and they played them on huge speakers into the jungles, which was supposedly to demoralize and scare the Viet Cong.
I did that same one too.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was actually, we talked about that in another episode as well, in a loyalist episode where there's a whole bunch of different war tactics that are kind of cool. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting because the Viet Cong believed that if someone wasn't placed properly in a burial spot, that their soul was basically doomed to walk the earth. And so with everyone just dying in war, you had people dying all over the place. I mean, the U.S., they took advantage of that, definitely.
Yeah.
And they strap these massive speakers, loudspeakers, to helicopters, cars, boats. Even guys would walk around with speakers on their back, at night, and make these sounds. I mean, they would use them at their base to help just ward off Viet Cong because it was so scary to them.
Interesting.
Crazy.
Well, yeah, it's funny. You ever heard about those? Like the cargo ships. How they have these Somalian pirates that come and they attack the cargo ships. Do you know what the cargo ships do to fend off these Somalian pirates?
They spray them with water hoses.
Yeah. What do you know what else they do?
Oh, don't they play like really ridiculous music or
They
something?
play Britney Spears. Britney's "Hit Me Baby One More Time," and that music has gotten them to stop more often than not. They're just like, dude, I'm done with this. It's not even worth it. They'll just blast "Hit Me Baby One More Time" on like the loudspeaker so loud that they'll just be like, oh, we just can't do this. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, because it's kind of a lengthy process. They come in, they circle the boats, they do all those kind of things, and interesting.
Yeah, so that's kind of an intimidation tactic, and they're just like, dude, I'm not messing with that.
Nobody mess with Britney Spears.
Yeah. There's some other cool ones here. I have kind of a longer one that talks about the Spartans. So I think you can't really talk about intimidation without talking about the Spartan warriors. And the Spartan men not only had skills and training to back up their reputation, but they also had the appearance and the intimidation tactics to that match the
6-pack abs,
their prowess. Yeah, exactly. So Spartans, the idea was to terrorize your enemy before you even got within spear's length. That's what I talked about earlier, is to get them on their heels so that they're already shaking in their boots, or like as in the movie he says, with their hearts gripped with icy fingers at the thought of what Leonidas and his 300 did to their previous army, so.
Or when the guy comes and they like cut off his arm, and the guy from the Persian says, our arrows will blot out the sun.
Yeah.
And what does he say?
We'll fight in the shade.
Then we will fight in the shade.
Yeah. Talking about intimidation, you throwing out all this intimidation, and their arrows did blot out the sun. But he's like, you know what? We're going to fight anyway. That was cool. That's epic, obviously one of the most epic quotes of all time. Other than, of course, Molo and Labe, where he says, come and get them. Or they say, lay down your weapons, and he says, come and get them. So anybody who knows, that's a really big amongst the Second Amendment loving Americans out there, is that we don't want to give up our guns, and if you want to take them, then come and get them. So love that quote. So anyway, the Spartan warriors, they stood straight, and they stood in steady formation, and basically the way that they stood, the way that they looked was, and their clothes and equipment matched their strength, discipline, and their ferocity. And so they had a couple different things. They had their scarlet tunic, which was their cape that they would kind of toss off before they ran into battle. So there was a historian named, probably going to butcher his name, Xenophon. He tells that the color was, quote, the least resemblance to a woman's clothing and to be most suitable for war. So that just looking back at history. So it was kind of a masculine color, as what he's saying, and at least most suitable for war. And that's kind of where the apocryphal idea came from, that it was because it was red, it would hide your blood and hide your weakness from your enemy. So that's why it was good for war. Kind of like what Deadpool, he says, that's why my suit is red so you can't see my blood, right?
Yeah. And then he goes, oh, you should have brought your brown pants.
Exactly. So the Spartan hoplite carried armor and a shield, which was buffed basically to a brilliant shine. And the Spartans actually wore their hair long. The long hair was a symbolic of a free man in their society. And they believed that it made, quote, that it made the handsome more comely and the ugly more frightful. So the handsome person, comely means like pleasant or pleasing, and then the ugly more frightful. And the Spartans kept themselves well groomed, often braiding their hair or keeping their beards neatly trimmed. That was one thing about Patton as well. Patton was also very neatly groomed, always shaved, always sharp, never dirty, or at least he tried not to be. And he had a big issues with. There was a cartoon artist in the war that came out with a cartoon about. And when they depicted the soldiers, they would depict them, these hardened soldiers, they would depict them as having beards and scraggly and dirty clothes and all this kind of stuff. And Patton took a big issue with that because he wanted, soldiers to be represented as clean cut, sharp type soldiers. So that was interesting. Another thing they had was the hair. So they had their helmets, and their heads were placed on top of their helmets. Was that long horse hair? There was like a big fin on top of their helmet, and it created the illusion that they were much taller in stature, and that terrified the enemy. Another thing that's interesting is their helmet. Now, there's a book called Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield, and it's a work of fiction, but he does a lot of historically accurate details, and he describes the Spartan helmet, as the most frightening of all. So I think it's interesting here what he kind of describes this as. He says, adding further to the theater of terror presented by the Hellenic phalanx, so that's their square formations, or the blank, expressionless facings of the Greek helmets, with their bronze nasals thick as a man's thumb, their flaring cheek pieces, and the unholy hollows of their eye slits, covering the entire face and projecting to the enemy the sensation that he was facing not creatures of flesh like himself, but some ghastly, invulnerable machine, pitiless and unquenchable. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, you're like looking into a void.
And the samurai also did something similar. They have the samurai masks, which were to protect your face somewhat, but it was also just to scare and intimidate.
A lot of them had like crazy faces on them and stuff like that.
Some of them had long noses so they could look like demons. So that they had
like horns and stuff.
You're going into battle and you looks like a demon's charging at you. You're like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. The clothing and equipment Spartans wore basically served two purposes. One, it made the soldier himself feel more ferocious, and we talked about that earlier, with that confidence that they built with him. And then two, it intimidated the heck out of their foes, which was the second purpose of it. And so I think that's just one great example of how the Spartans kind of softened up the enemy's lines before they even got to him. And that's kind of in that movie 300 at the end when he talks about how they've already know what 300 of us can do, and that's what they have on their minds right now. And now they're about to face thousands of us, and they're shaking in their boots. And that last scene is like so powerful.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah, that's crazy. So it's so interesting, some of these tactics that people who thought of this stuff too. It's like, and maybe it's just because maybe it was, some of these things weren't done for a particular reason, but I like to think that they were. A couple of, so just some short ones here. Alexander the Great would spread rumors that his troops' savagery. Like he would spread rumors that they were cannibals, that they were this and they were that. He would have his people go and spread those rumors into the regions that he wanted to conquer, so that whenever they were like, oh, Alexander the Great's coming with his armies, they were like, oh crap, his soldiers are just crazy, right? So they were just kind of rumors. I thought this was really cool. So at times the Macedonians, they had oversized body armor built that they would leave lying on the battlefields so that their enemies would find them and think that they were giants. Like purposefully built armor that was massive. Huh. And then these people would pick this up and be like, who had this sword? Or whose helmet is this? Or whatever it is. And so they would think that they had giants amongst their ranks.
I have a similar story to that. This is a rumor. I wasn't able to confirm this because I looked back, but apparently there was a rumor that in World War II, they would drop condoms behind the enemy lines, and they were like foot-long condoms, but they were labeled as mediums, and they were supposed to be for the American soldiers, and it was to intimidate the enemy soldiers. Like, oh my gosh, if this is a medium, I don't want to know what a large is.
Jeez.
Like, we got to give up on these guys.
Oh, that's funny.
Hey guys, just wanted to take a quick break and say thank you for listening today and invite you to support us on Patreon. As a loyalist supporter, you get access to 2 additional episodes per month, which are not released publicly. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the episode description. let's get back to the show.
So, that guy I talked about earlier who would build the pyramids of skulls. He was a Mongolian chieftain. A couple other ones, different tactics that I thought were interesting that have been, I guess, intimidating in the past have been propaganda. We kind of talked about this earlier, but one of the things that the American and British did is they created fake operation papers that they allowed to get captured during World War II that had basically fake operations on it, saying that D-Day was going to be somewhere else. And it actually did work. They did trick a certain amount of I guess, platoons or whatever else. I don't know all the specific history of it, but it did work to a certain extent, and there wasn't as many people on Normandy that there could have been because of this, basically this trickery that they used.
Misdirection, yeah.
Yeah, misdirection. Another tactic that the military often has is what's called shock and awe, military action of pure aggression. It's kind of inspired out of the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Basically, it was an act of just pure aggression, and the Japanese, upon seeing the mass loss of life and utter destruction, they just immediately surrendered. They were just like, we're done.
We can't go up against that. This is too big.
We're done.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the military has actually used this tactic of shock and awe several times, and going into certain parts of Iraq or whatever else, that they'll they will lay siege to an area and drop 10 times the amount of bombs and mortars and everything else that they actually need to
demoralize the enemy.
Just to boom, so that they say, "Oh my gosh, if they can do this, what else can they do?" Right?
Yeah.
And so that shock and awe is kind of crazy.
Yeah, one of the examples of when I think of shock and awe, you remember that first Iron Man where he's goes out there and he shows them the Jericho missile.
Yeah.
And he's just behold Jericho, and the whole thing just goes absolutely destroys the hillside, and it's just
the shockwave, and he's just
I'm like, oh my gosh, that is some serious firepower. I'm like, that's what I think of when I think of shock and awe.
Yeah.
Or if you ever see videos of the Moab, you ever see the mother of all bombs?
Mm-hmm.
That thing is intense, man.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
So, one of the last things I wanted to say, well, this was kind of interesting too. You don't really think about this very much, but terrorism is kind of a form of intimidation, right? When you have, I guess living in the United States, then, seeing what acts of terrorism, whether it's bombings or 9/11 or whatever else.
Shootings or something.
Yeah, shootings and stuff like that, whether it's domestic or foreign terrorism or terrorists. It's basically people trying to, intimidate everyone into, believing in their cause, or maybe there's no rhyme or reason, but I just kind of thought it was interesting that in some of the things I looked at, that terrorism was actually linked under a intimidation tactic, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. You didn't talk about Blackbeard.
So I didn't talk about Blackbeard, but one of the things that I thought you were going to talk about Blackbeard.
I thought you were talking about that.
Well, there's a lack of communication apparently. So
one of the coolest ones that we originally thought of when we were like, oh, intimidation.
Oh yeah, I do remember I should have done Blackbeard.
Was Blackbeard. Whoops. So the Blackbeard was an infamous pirate, and he's kind of North Carolina has a special spot. He was a pirate off the coast of North Carolina, and his ship sunk right off the coast of North Carolina, and he was kind of an infamous legend. In fact, I think that the legend goes that when he died, they cut his head off and his body swam around the ship 3 times.
They cut his head off and they threw him overboard, and his body swam around the ship 3 times
before it sunk down into the depth of Davy Jones' locker. And so, anyway, the thing with him was that he had this long black hair, he had this big beard, and he would put cannon fuses into his hair, into the curls of his hair and his beard, and he would light them so it burn slow, and there'd be
slow burning fuses,
and there'd be smoke around him. So he'd step onto these ships that he boarded or that he's pirating, and it's almost like a demon stepping on board. And apparently, from what I understand of him, is that he was actually pretty merciful in the way that he wouldn't just kill everybody. He would just say, surrender, stop fighting. Either you surrender right away, or we will kill everybody. And so that actually helped him because he was a man of his word, and because he wouldn't just kill everybody anyway. They knew that if you were going up against Blackbeard, you just surrender, and he'll steal all your stuff, but he won't kill you. And that's how his crew and he actually was able to stay around for quite a long time, is because he didn't kill as many people. He didn't get into so many altercations. He built this demon persona that people were so terrified of him that he could just walk on, and people believed he was a man of his word. And so if he said he wouldn't kill you, he wouldn't kill you.
I think that's one thing around Blackbeard that's so interesting and has always been interesting to me, is that it was almost his reputation he was so infamous that the sound of that's Blackbeard's ship was just completely demoralizing and terrifying to anybody who was on the other side. So yeah, that's an interesting one. This last one that I had was kind of interesting. It's an example of how intimidation can actually be used as a defense in what you're doing. So, do you remember? I thought of this whenever I was writing these things down. You remember the OC? The show The OC?
Yeah, I do.
So this is just an example. Obviously, this is a fictional TV show, but there's one point to where the main character, he kind of has they're supposed to be in high school, but they look 25 or whatever, look 30. Right? There's this one guy that had been really picking on him, and he was a really good fighter, and he was a really good he was a massive jerk, but he was always kind of picking on this one guy. And it got to the point to where they were under a pier or something like that, and they were the main character, his name's Ryan, he got jumped by this guy and maybe 2 or 3 of his friends or something like that, and he was completely outnumbered. He wasn't going to win the fight, and so instead he just acted like he was completely crazy, and he grabbed a glass bottle and broke it on one of the pylons of the pier, and so it was super sharp, and he was like, if we're gonna do this, somebody's gonna die, and he was just saying all these crazy things, if you want to go, let's go, and I mean, it was almost like he was so intimidating in what he was doing, and it was his posture and what he was saying and what he was doing, and he had this glass thing. He had no intention on actually hurting anybody. It was all for show. And the guy was like, oh, he was so taken aback that he was just no, it's not worth it, man. It's not worth it. And they left. It was almost like that intimidation saved him.
Yeah. I mean, you think about in the animal world, there's so many natural ways that animals have evolved over the years that make them look more intimidating. I mean, like animals that look like they have eyes, or they posture so that their feathers go out and it makes them look bigger, or they puff up their manes, or they puff up their feathers, or whatever it may be to look larger. That's why they say if a bobcat ever comes up to you, look as large as you can and yell at it and intimidate it, and then it'll back down. In fact, when I was working at Goldman in Utah, it was right up on top of the hills where the offices was, right on top of the mountain. Well, there was a mountain right behind our office building, and then behind that there was absolutely nothing. It was just mountains. And they had sent an email out saying if there's been some mountain lions in the parking lot, if you see a mountain lion, then yell at it and tell it to get out of here and try to appear as big as possible. And the people from New York thought that was the craziest thing they had ever heard, because
those rednecks out in Utah
have to fight mountain lions to get into work in the morning. And, these guys are
like, all I fight is people on the subway.
Yeah, exactly. Geez. It's like if you find a crackhead,
all I find
yell as loud as you can and put your arms as wide as you can.
All I find is homeless people on the streets.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things funny things I thought about is, remember that movie Over the Top?
Oh yeah.
Sylvester
Stallone.
Remember the guy that was trying to intimidate everybody? There's a guy in the last like arm wrestling scene where like
it was like the finals or something like that.
He's like he's eating like a cigar. He is smoking a cigar, and then he just like eats the whole cigar. He just like chews it into his mouth.
I think he had like a butt left, and it was like he couldn't have it before he went on, and so he was up there and in front of his opponent. He like put it in his mouth and like chewed up the rest.
He put
of
it
the
on his tongue and put it out, and then he put it in his mouth and ate the whole cigar. And then he beat the guy, and then the next one is he takes some motor oil and he's like
drinking motor oil.
He pours it into his mouth. And then like this shows him in the next scene, he's like drinking some.
He's like taking Tums or something like that, and he's like looks super sick or like throws up or something.
It was the stuff, the fizzy stuff, Alka-Seltzer. He's drinking some Alka-Seltzer because he's drinking motor oil.
Yeah, and he's like, oh, because he feels terrible.
But yeah, I mean,
but he looked scary doing it.
Yeah, it's so funny. Intimidation. When you look at basically any wrestling, it's all intimidation. Like the WWE and stuff like that. It's all fake, obviously, but if you didn't know that by now, it's just funny how they intimidate each other and the way that they interact. It's all a posturing game, but yeah, there's so much to intimidation and how it works and how different societies have used it to scare the enemy or to scare their opponents. And even in the corporate world, people use it. I was telling Ethan before we started recording, I was like, I was reading this article about corporate intimidation, and it was an old article from the New York Times about how Harvey Weinstein was so intimidating, and I was like, oh, that article aged poorly. I think he got 26 years in prison for the stuff he just did. They just sentenced him. But yeah, he was definitely a bully. So I think that there's a spectrum of intimidation from terrorism, bullying, and then from also you can look at the other extreme to say like you're so confident in yourself.
Yeah.
It doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. You're so confident in yourself that others are terrified of you. And so, interesting way. Love this topic. I think it's so cool to explore different things, explore some history on it, as well as how we view it today. So,
yeah, I just like hearing these stories. There's so many stories out there. And if I don't know if you want to hear more stories like this, we have lots of episodes where we just tell cool stories like this. So go back and look at some of those interesting episodes on some of the topics that...
Even our Patreon episodes, we talk about some cool stuff. In fact, in July, our first episode in July, we came out with the samurai, the code of conduct of the samurai. We talk about some really cool
Bushido,
really cool stories about the samurai. That was a fun episode.
Yeah.
And so go check that out if you want to support us on Patreon. It's only $5 a month, and you get 2 episodes a month, as well as we'll send you
2 extra episodes.
Extra episodes that are
exclusive.
Exactly, and we'll send you a Brothers Creed decal that you can put on your water bottle, on your car, or wherever to show your support. So, thank you all for joining today, and let's build that creed together.
All right, let's do it.